The wind howled through the frozen pines of Vermont, carrying the weight of a storm that swallowed everything in white. Snow hammered down like shards of glass against the windshield of an old pickup truck, stranded on the roadside. Inside, the heater had long died, and the only sound was the shallow, ragged breathing of a child. Emily Carter pressed her daughter closer to her chest, trying to warm her with trembling hands. Sophie's small lips had turned pale, her lashes frosted white. Emily whispered through chattering teeth, "Hold on, baby, please just hold on." Her words disappeared into the blizzard. The radio crackled with static, a monotone voice breaking through every few seconds. All roads to the city hospital are closed due to the storm. Authorities urge all residents to remain indoors. Emily's heart sank. She had already been trapped for hours alone, with the gas tank empty and her phone battery dead. The world outside her window was endless snow and silence. She brushed the ice from the windshield with her sleeve and stared ahead. Somewhere beyond the swirling white, she could barely make out a flicker of yellow light in the distance. Then she remembered what the old man at the gas station had said. Before the storm rolled in, "There's a house up there in the woods, Hale Estate. Belongs to a rich man, a recluse. Used to run a medical company that helped kids. If you ever get lost, follow the old road. You might still see the lights." It had sounded like a story, not a direction. But now it was all she had left. Emily wrapped Sophie tighter in the thin blanket covering her face from the biting wind. She pushed open the truck door, the hinges screaming in protest. The storm roared louder instantly, stealing her breath. Each step into the snow was a battle. Her boots sank deep, the cold cutting through to her skin. The light ahead flickered like a mirage, sometimes visible, sometimes gone. She walked anyway, whispering to her child, "We're almost there, sweetheart. Just a little more. Mama's got you." Minutes turned to hours. Her legs burned. The snow rose past her knees. She could no longer feel her feet. But the light grew stronger now, shining from behind a tall iron gate that loomed like a shadowed giant in the storm. She stumbled forward and gripped the frozen bars, shaking them weakly. Her knuckles bled from the cold. Beyond the gate stood a mansion, half hidden by the snowdrifts, its windows glowing faintly with golden light. "Please," she rasped someone. "Please help us." She pressed the buzzer. No answer. She tried again, harder this time, but only the wind replied. Panic clawed at her chest. She hit the buzzer again and again until her fingers went numb. "Please," she whispered. "Please open." Her strength gave out. She fell to her knees, clutching Sophie close. Then the door opened. A man appeared in the golden light, spilling from the doorway. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a gray sweater. His hair was disheveled, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. Nathan Hale. He stared at her for a moment, confused. Then his gaze hardened. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice cold, distant. "This property is private." Emily tried to speak, but only a broken sound came out. She looked up, her face, pale lips trembling. "Please," she managed, "my daughter." He sighed, shaking his head. "I'm sorry. You need to find a shelter in town." He began to close the door. The world seemed to slow. The door was halfway shut when something caught his eye. A small arm, limp and lifeless, slipped from the folds of the gray blanket in Emily's arms. Time froze. Nathan's hand stopped on the doorframe. The color drained from his face. For the first time in years, he felt his pulse race. He stepped closer, his voice rough. What's wrong with her?" Emily's tears froze on her cheeks. She tried to speak, but her throat closed with pain. Her voice was a whisper swallowed by the wind. "Please, bury my child." The words struck him harder than the cold. Nathan dropped to his knees beside her, his heart hammering. He peeled back the corner of the blanket. Sophie's skin was ghostly pale, her tiny chest still. His gloved fingers brushed her neck. For a second there was nothing, then faintly a tremor beneath his touch. A heartbeat, barely there but there. He leaned in, pressing his ear to her chest, disbelief flooding his face. "Wait," he breathed. "She's still breathing?" His voice broke into the storm. Emily's head lifted eyes wide with fragile hope. Nathan looked at her, then back to the child, his hands trembling. He shouted over the wind, "Get inside, now." The storm roared behind them, erasing their footprints, as he carried the child into the light. The heavy door closed, sealing them inside. For the first time in years, the house of the billionaire recluse was no longer silent. The sound of the wind vanished the moment the heavy oak door slammed shut. Inside the grand but dimly lit mansion, warmth flickered from the fire that crackled in the stone hearth. Nathan Hale stood motionless for a second, snow melting in his hair, breath clouding the air. The woman collapsed near the entryway, clutching her child, as if afraid the world would snatch her away. This way, he muttered, his voice hoarse. He bent down, lifted the limp little girl from her mother's trembling arms, and carried her down the hall. The house felt frozen in time. Dust lay thick on the furniture curtains, drawn tight against the world. The scent of cedar and old medicine lingered in the air. Emily staggered behind him, her feet dragging her coat soaked through. They reached a room at the back of the house, a place that looked like a forgotten laboratory. Steel counters lined the walls, medical tools, neatly arranged and untouched for years. A single monitor glowed faintly, illuminating shelves of glass bottles and surgical equipment. Nathan placed the girl gently on a table, his hands shaking. He had not been inside this room in nearly 3 years. The last time he stood there, he had watched his own daughter's life fade on a hospital screen halfway across the world, while his company's algorithm denied her claim. He had buried more than a child that day. He had buried himself. "What's her name?" he asked quietly. "Sophie," Emily whispered. Her voice cracked. "She's 5. Nathan nodded, once his mind shifting into a mode he thought he had lost. His movements became quick, deliberate. He unwrapped the blanket, exposing the child's tiny body, cold and still but not lifeless. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck again. "Pulse is weak," he murmured. He glanced at Emily. "Has she been sick, fever?" "Since yesterday," Emily said through tears. "The storm hit before I could get her to the hospital. I tried everything. I couldn't." Her words dissolved into sobs. "It's all right," he said without looking at her. "She's still here." He pulled open a drawer, retrieving a small oxygen mask. The equipment was old, dusty, but functional. He connected it to a portable tank, checking the valve, then fitted it carefully over Sophie's face. Emily hovered behind him, her hands clenched, whispering prayers. "Come on," Nathan said softly, almost to himself. He rubbed the girl's sternum in gentle circles, then reached for a syringe. His mind raced through calculations, weighing her size, her temperature, her oxygen levels. He drew up a clear liquid from a vial and injected it into her arm with steady precision. The machine beeped faintly, then again. He leaned in, watching the faint rise and fall of her chest. The sound of breathing returned, fragile but real. Emily gasped, covering her mouth. "Oh God," she whispered. Nathan exhaled long and heavy. His shoulders slumped. "She's breathing," he said quietly. "She's still breathing." He removed his gloves, rubbing his hands over his face. For a moment, the silence returned, broken only by the fire in the hearth and the faint hiss of oxygen. Emily moved closer, her eyes wet, her voice trembling. "You saved her." Nathan turned his gaze to her, the firelight catching the hollows under his eyes. "Not yet," he said, "but I'll try." He walked to a nearby cabinet, pulling out an old wool blanket, and draped it over Emily's shoulders. "She needs warmth and rest. You both do." Emily stared at him, confusion flickering behind exhaustion. "Who are you?" he hesitated. "Nathan Hale." Her eyes widened. "You're the Hale Bio guy, the billionaire." He didn't answer. Instead, he adjusted the oxygen flow, avoiding her gaze. "The one who disappeared," she murmured. Nathan froze for a second, his jaw tightening. "Disappeared is one word for it," he said finally. "Some might say I just stopped pretending to care." He turned off the overhead light, leaving only the warm glow from a single lamp. His voice softened. "You can stay here tonight. There's a guest room upstairs, towels in the hall. Get dry before you freeze." Emily hesitated, looking from him to her daughter. "I won't leave her." Nathan nodded. "Then stay here. I'll get more blankets." He left the room, footsteps echoing through the quiet halls. Emily sat beside Sophie, brushing a hand over her daughter's forehead. The child's skin was warm, now faint color, returning to her cheeks. For the first time in days, Emily allowed herself to breathe. In the next room, Nathan leaned against the wall, his heart pounding. His hands were still trembling. He stared down at them, remembering the last patient he'd tried to save, the one who bore his wife's name on a medical chart and never made it home. "Not again," he whispered. "Please, not again." He returned an hour later, with tea, placing the cup near Emily's side. She looked up, her eyes rimmed red but grateful. "Thank you," she said softly. He only nodded. For a long while, neither spoke. The storm raged outside, rattling the windows, but inside the old house there was something else stirring, a fragile quiet neither of them understood. When Emily finally fell asleep in the chair beside her daughter, Nathan stood in the doorway watching. The glow from the lamp cast soft shadows across the girl's face, highlighting the rise and fall of her chest. He felt a pull deep in his chest, something he had buried with the past. Hope. He clenched his fists, almost angry at the feeling. "Don't do this," he muttered to himself. "Don't start feeling again." But it was too late. Somewhere between the silence and the storm, the man who had forgotten how to feel had taken his first breath again. When Emily opened her eyes, sunlight was slipping weakly through the frost-coated windows. For a second, she did not remember where she was. The room was unfamiliar, the ceiling high, the air faintly scented with cedar and smoke. Then she saw her daughter curled under a heavy blanket beside the fireplace. A soft pink flush on her cheeks, Sophie was breathing steady and strong. Emily pressed a hand to her mouth, choking on a sound between laughter and sobbing. The memory of last night came back in flashes, the storm, the door, the stranger with haunted eyes. On the table beside her was a mug of coffee, still warm, and a folded note, written in neat handwriting. "She'll be fine. Rest." Emily held the note for a long time, tracing the letters as though they might vanish. She rose carefully, her legs stiff from the cold. The floor was polished wood, the rugs thick and old. Everywhere she looked, the house was both grand and lonely paintings. Half covered in dust books stacked in uneven towers, photographs turned face down. She stopped at one framed picture left upright on a shelf. A woman and a child smiled back at her. The woman had gentle eyes, the kind that carried laughter. The little girl wore a ribbon in her hair. Emily felt a strange ache in her chest. Behind her footsteps echoed softly on the stairs. She turned to find Nathan standing there, sleeves rolled up his hair, damp as if he had just washed away the night. He held 2 steaming mugs. "You're awake," he said quietly. His voice was lower, now softer. He handed her one of the mugs. "Drink this. You look half frozen still." Emily took it, the warmth seeping into her fingers. "Thank you for last night, for everything." Nathan shrugged as if brushing it away. "You don't need to thank me." He walked toward the window, staring out at the world buried in snow. The silence between them stretched thin, but not uncomfortable. "I saw the picture in the hall," she said finally. He didn't turn. "My wife and daughter." He answered after a moment. His tone was flat, stripped of emotion. "They're gone." Emily hesitated. "I'm sorry." He nodded once, still facing the glass. "So am I." They stood like that for a while, 2 strangers tied together by the quiet sound of a child breathing in the next room. "Why did you help us?" she asked softly. Nathan's reflection in the glass looked older than his years. "Because someone once begged me to do the same," he said. "And I didn't." Emily frowned, unsure what he meant, but the weight in his voice stopped her from asking more. He turned to her, then the sharpness in his gaze, dulled by fatigue. "You can stay until the road's clear," he said. "There's food in the pantry, extra clothes upstairs. Just don't go near the east wing." "The east wing," she repeated. "It's closed," he said simply, and walked away. She watched him disappear down the corridor, the sound of his footsteps fading into the walls. The rest of the day passed in a haze of warmth and exhaustion. Emily cleaned what she could, grateful for something to do. Sophie slept peacefully, her fever gone. Every now and then, Emily caught herself glancing toward the door, listening for Nathan's steps, but the house stayed quiet. At dusk, the sky outside turned pale blue, the snow glowing with the last light of day. Emily found Nathan sitting on the front porch, a blanket draped over his shoulders, staring into the forest as if waiting for something that would never return. She hesitated at the door, then stepped outside. "It's beautiful," she said, trying to fill the silence. "When it isn't trying to kill you?" He gave a small, humorless laugh. "Vermont's like that." She looked at him, studying the lines on his face. "You live out here alone?" "Mostly," he said. "There's the dog somewhere." And the silence. "It keeps me company." Silence doesn't sound like much of a friend. Sometimes it's better than the alternative. She wanted to ask what that meant, but his eyes had drifted toward the trees again. He looked lost, like a man standing on the edge of something invisible. She sat beside him anyway, their breath mingling in the cold. For a long moment they said nothing. The only sound was the faint creak of snow settling on the roof. When she went back inside later that night, Sophie was awake, her small voice sleepy but bright. "Mommy, where are we?" "Somewhere safe," Emily whispered. "Go back to sleep." Sophie smiled and turned over, clutching the little wooden horse Nathan had left by her bed. Upstairs, faint music drifted down the hall. Emily paused, listening. A piano. The notes were uneven, hesitant, as though the player had forgotten the song halfway through, but couldn't stop trying. She followed the sound to the base of the stairs, looking up. Through the cracked door at the end of the hallway, She saw Nathan at the piano, his fingers moving slowly across the keys. The fire beside him cast his face in soft amber light. There was no sheet music, just memory and pain. The melody faltered, stopped, then started again. Emily watched from the shadows, afraid to disturb him. The song was unfinished, but heartbreakingly beautiful. It was the sound of a man who once believed in miracles and then stopped. She thought of how he had looked when he found Sophie's heartbeat. The disbelief, the trembling relief. He wasn't cold, she realized. He was broken. And somewhere beneath the silence of that house, beneath the weight of grief and guilt, something was beginning to thaw. When she returned to her room, she lay awake for a long time, listening to the distant piano notes fade into the night. The storm outside had quieted. Inside the house still held its ghosts, but for the first time it also held the sound of life. The storm finally broke 2 days later, leaving the world blanketed in a soft, endless white. Sunlight glinted off the snowdrifts, scattering reflections across the windows of the Hale estate. Inside, the air was still touched by the faint smell of coffee and cedar wood. Emily stood at the kitchen counter, stirring soup on the stove she had wiped clean that morning. The fire in the hearth crackled, its warmth filling the empty house. Behind her, the sound of footsteps made her glance over her shoulder. Nathan entered, sleeves rolled up, a book in one hand. He paused at the sight of her cooking. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "You've already done enough," she replied without looking up. "Least I can do is make lunch." I wasn't complaining. His tone softened, carrying the hint of a smile she hadn't heard before. "I forgot what real food smells like." Emily turned slightly, the corners of her mouth lifting. "Then you're welcome." He leaned against the counter, watching her for a moment. Sophie's still asleep. "Out like a light," Emily said, stirring the pot. She must have needed it. Nathan nodded. His gaze flicked toward the small living room where a coloring book lay open beside the couch. A crayon rolled lazily to the floor. The sight seemed to pull something unspoken from him. "She reminds me of someone," he murmured. "Your daughter." He hesitated, then nodded once. "Mira." The name lingered in the air like the echo of a prayer. Emily said nothing, sensing the fragility behind it. After lunch, Sophie woke up, hair-tousled, cheeks rosy. She ran toward Nathan with the natural trust of a child untouched by the world's hardness. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," she chirped. He blinked, startled by the warmth in her tone. "Morning, Sophie. Mom says you saved me." He shook his head. "I think you did most of the work." She giggled, then darted off to play with the dog that had finally appeared from somewhere in the house, tail wagging. Emily watched the scene with quiet amusement. "She likes you," she said. "Kids usually don't," he replied dryly. "They sense things adults ignore. Maybe they see who you really are." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. And who is that someone who still cares, even when it hurts? Her words hung between them, fragile and daring. Nathan looked away first. That afternoon, while Sophie napped, Emily wandered through the house, exploring cautiously. She found shelves filled with medical books, research journals, and news articles about Hale Bio. One headline caught her eye. "Halibio CEO resigns after insurance. Algorithm denies coverage in high-profile case." Beneath it was a photograph of Nathan standing outside a courthouse, his face pale, surrounded by microphones. The date was 3 years ago. She set the paper down, understanding dawning like a slow ache. That night over dinner, she asked quietly, You built hospitals for millions. Why did you stop? Nathan froze his fork halfway to his mouth. For a long time he didn't answer. Then he set it down and leaned back, eyes fixed on the flames. Because the world buried my family, he said finally. And I buried my purpose with them. Emily's breath caught. Your wife and daughter. He nodded, his jaw tightening. Mira had a rare immune condition. My own system, the one I designed, flagged her claim as ineligible because of a technicality. She died waiting for approval. They called it a glitch. I called it murder. The silence that followed was heavy but not cold. Emily reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand. That wasn't your fault, wasn't it? He asked softly. It was my company, my algorithm. I built it to save lives. Instead, it calculated the price of them. He exhaled slowly, as if letting go of a piece of himself. After that, I couldn't look at another patient, another number, without seeing her face. Emily's eyes glistened. I know what it's like to lose faith in everything you thought was right. Nathan looked up, surprised. Your husband. She nodded. He came home from Afghanistan a different man. Angry, lost. When he drank, She stopped, pressing her lips together. One night he hit me. The next morning he was gone. They said his car went off the road in the rain. I never found out if it was an accident or a choice. Nathan's gaze softened. I'm sorry, don't be. We both died a little that night, me and the person I used to be. They sat in silence, two broken people surrounded by the soft hum of the storm outside. Then Sophie's laughter echoed from the other room, bright and innocent. The sound pulled them both back. She's tougher than me, Emily said, smiling faintly. She's the reason I keep going. Nathan studied her for a moment, the firelight flickering in his eyes. You're stronger than you think. So are you, she said. He gave a small, disbelieving laugh. I'm not sure about that. You opened your door, she said simply. That's more strength than most people ever show. Her words seemed to settle deep inside him, dislodging something long buried. Later that evening, when Sophie had fallen asleep, with a coloring book still open beside her, Nathan sat by the fire, lost in thought. Emily joined him, holding 2 cups of tea. She handed one to him, their fingers brushing. Neither pulled away. You know, she said softly, for someone who says he doesn't care anymore, you have a strange way of proving otherwise. He looked at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. And for someone who nearly froze to death on my doorstep, you've made yourself very at home. She laughed quietly, the sound like the first break in winter ice. The firelight danced between them, soft and golden. In that moment, something changed, not loudly or dramatically, but in a way that felt irreversible. The walls he had built around his heart shifted just enough for warmth to slip through. For the first time in years, Nathan Hale did not feel alone in his house of silence. And for the first time in years, Emily Carter allowed herself to believe that not every door opened in desperation had to close in sorrow. The night settled over the mountains like a blanket of velvet, thick and silent. Snow drifted lazily outside the windows of the Hale estate, catching the light from the fire that burned low in the hearth. Emily sat curled in an armchair near the flames, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold. Across from her, Nathan sat in the shadows, his elbows on his knees, staring into the flickering embers as if they could rewrite the past. The house had grown quieter since Sophie fell asleep upstairs, her soft breathing the only sound above the crackle of firewood. It felt like the world had shrunk to this single room, two people and 1,000 unspoken things between them. Emily broke the silence first. You ever think about what you'd say to them if you could? She asked softly. Nathan's eyes flicked to hers, weary but alert. To who, the ones we lost? Nathan leaned back slowly, the firelight tracing the hard lines of his face. Every day, he said after a moment, but it's not what I'd say that keeps me up. It's what I didn't. He stood, walked to the window, and drew back the curtain slightly. Snow was still falling, but gently now, as if the world had softened its anger. I used to believe the world ran on logic, he continued. That if I built something perfect, something that could measure fairness, pain could be prevented. But I was wrong. The world doesn't care about fairness. It only understands loss. Emily watched him, her heart tightening. You lost your family because you tried to save others, she said. That doesn't make you guilty, doesn't it? He asked quietly, turning to face her. My wife trusted me. My daughter trusted me. And when it mattered, the system I created, meant to protect them, let them die. His voice cracked on the last word, barely audible. He pressed his palms to the glass, as if bracing himself against memories that refused to fade. I buried them here, he said finally. Not literally, but I might as well have. This house, it became a tomb the moment they were gone. Emily's eyes glistened. She set her mug aside and stood moving toward him. Nathan, she whispered, you didn't kill them, didn't I? He turned to her, his eyes raw. Every headline, every protest, every lawsuit said I did. And the worst part is, sometimes I believe them. Emily reached out her hand, trembling slightly, and touched his arm. He didn't pull away. You built something that could have saved millions, she said. That's not evil, that's hope. You made a mistake, and you've been paying for it ever since. Nathan let out a sharp laugh, hollow and bitter. Hope, he repeated. That's a dangerous word. So is guilt, she said. It can eat you alive. He looked at her, and for the first time that night, his eyes softened. And you, he asked, what are you carrying that you won't say out loud? Emily hesitated, her throat tight. I was 20 when I met Daniel, she began. He was older, charming, a soldier, back from overseas. I thought he was strong because he protected me from the world. I didn't see that he needed protection from himself. She paused, her voice barely above a whisper. He had nightmares, flashbacks. At first, he just drank to sleep. Then he drank to stay awake. The night he raised his hand at me, I saw something in his eyes that wasn't him anymore. I took Sophie and left. A week later, they called me to identify what was left of his car. Nathan said nothing. His silence wasn't empty. It was listening. I blamed myself, she continued. I told myself if I'd stayed, maybe he wouldn't have lost control. Maybe he wouldn't have. She broke off, swallowing hard, but then I realized I would have lost Sophie too. And I couldn't. She was all I had left. Nathan's hand moved toward hers, without thought, resting gently on top. You did what you had to, he said. No one should have to choose between love and survival. Emily met his eyes. We both chose survival, she said quietly. But somewhere along the way, we forgot what it means to live. The fire popped, sending a spark into the air. Nathan exhaled slowly. Maybe that's what this is, he said. Two ghosts trying to remember how to breathe. She smiled faintly. Then maybe we're in the right place. You built hospitals to save lives. I came here begging you to bury one. Somewhere in between, we found a reason to keep going. Nathan studied her, the corners of his mouth, curving just slightly. You talk like someone who still believes in redemption. Maybe I just met someone who makes me believe it's possible. The silence that followed was softer than before, warm and full. Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the world in white. Nathan moved to stir the fire, then sat back beside her closer this time. "It's strange," he murmured, staring into the flames. 3 years I've lived in this house, and this is the first night it doesn't feel like a grave." Emily leaned back, her eyes reflecting the light. Maybe that's because it isn't anymore. Their hands brushed as they both reached for the same log to feed the fire. Neither moved away. The air between them shifted quiet, electric, alive. The sound of Sophie's soft breathing drifted faintly from upstairs, grounding them in the present. Emily turned her head, her voice a whisper. "Nathan." He looked at her. "What, thank you," she said simply, "for opening the door." His expression softened. "I almost didn't." "But you did," she said, her lips trembling into a smile. "And because of that, we're both still breathing." He didn't answer. He just looked at her for a long moment, the reflection of the fire dancing in his eyes. And in that silence, something wordless passed between them. Understanding, forgiveness, the fragile beginnings of love. Upstairs, the wind rattled faintly against the glass, but inside the Hale estate, the cold had finally begun to melt. By morning, the storm had lifted completely, leaving the mountains washed clean and glittering under a new sun. The roads were still buried, but light poured through the tall windows, painting the house in shades of gold and quiet peace. Emily was at the kitchen sink washing dishes when she heard Sophie's laughter echo through the hall, followed by Nathan's low, amused voice. It was the kind of sound that made the house feel alive again. For a moment, it almost felt like a home. But peace never lasts long for those the world has already branded. It started with a drone camera humming outside the window. Nathan noticed it first while carrying a tray of breakfast into the living room. He froze, his jaw tightening. The small machine hovered like an eye blinking red before darting away into the sky. Emily saw his face pale. "What is it?" she asked, drying her hands. "Trouble," he said. "Someone found us." Within hours, the world that had forgotten Nathan Hale remembered him again. News outlets lit up with headlines. "Disgraced billionaire found hiding in Vermont mansion." "Nathan Hale shelters unidentified woman and child." By noon, the gates outside were surrounded by reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones waved in the cold wind. A helicopter circled overhead. Emily stood at the window, clutching Sophie close as the noise grew louder. "Oh my God," she whispered. They think whatever sells Nathan," said his voice sharp but calm. He turned off his phone and threw it onto the counter. "I knew this would happen eventually. I just didn't think it would be this soon." "What do we do?" she asked. "We stay inside," he said. "They'll get bored and leave." But they didn't. By afternoon, a black SUV pulled up the driveway, followed by 2 more. Nathan's old partner, Richard Wexler, stepped out, flanked by men in suits. Cameras swarmed around him like flies. "Nathan Hale owes his shareholders answers." Wexler shouted into the microphones. "The public deserves to know why a fugitive CEO is harboring a stranger in his home." Emily's heart pounded. "They're calling you a fugitive," she said. "That's not true, right?" Nathan exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Technically, no, but when you disappear after a corporate scandal, the world fills in the blanks." He glanced toward the window, his voice lowering. "And they'll fill them in with your name, too." Emily's breath caught. What are you saying? I'm saying they'll twist this. A billionaire recluse and a single mother found snowed in together. They'll turn it into something it isn't. Something it isn't, she asked, her voice trembling. What if it's something it is? Nathan froze. Their eyes met, and for a moment the noise outside disappeared. But then a knock thundered at the door, harsh and unrelenting. Open up, Mr. Hale, a voice called. We have questions about your guest. Nathan's expression hardened. He opened the door just enough to step outside, closing it behind him. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted. The cold air burned his lungs. Mr. Hale, are you and the woman romantically involved? Is she part of your cover-up? Who is the child? Nathan raised a hand, his voice cutting through the chaos. You want a statement? Here it is. The cameras leaned closer. 3 nights ago, a woman came to my door carrying her dying child, he said. You want to talk about scandal? Talk about a healthcare system that leaves mothers begging strangers for mercy in the snow. Talk about what we've all become. The reporters erupted, but Nathan's voice only grew steadier. You call me disgraced. Fine, I was. But this, he gestured toward the house, toward the child's laughter, faintly echoing inside. This is what redemption looks like. Not money, not power, a second chance. The crowd buzzed with confusion and curiosity. Flashbulbs flickered like lightning. So yes, Nathan continued, his voice ringing across the frozen yard. She and her daughter are under my roof, and if saving a life makes me guilty, then I accept every charge. The silence that followed was electric. Then the shouting resumed, questions, accusations, insults. But Nathan turned and walked back inside, slamming the heavy door behind him. Emily stood in the hallway, her eyes wide with fear and awe. You didn't have to do that, she said. They'll tear you apart. Let them, he said simply. I've been hiding long enough. He took a breath, steadying himself. You came here asking me to bury your child, but you gave me back my life instead. Her throat tightened. Nathan, I mean it. He said, his voice low, rough with emotion. Before that night, this house was nothing but a grave. You walked in and reminded me that breathing doesn't mean living. She felt tears rise unbidden. You can't protect me from them, she whispered. They'll twist everything. Then we'll face it together. He reached for her hand, and for a heartbeat, she let him take it. The world outside continued to howl. But inside the old house, it was calm again, 2 hearts steady in the storm. That evening, as darkness fell, the gates outside filled with lights again. But this time they weren't from the media, they were candles. Dozens of people from the nearby town had come holding signs that read, Mercy lives here. The Hale Foundation. Saved my son. Compassion is not a crime. Nathan stood at the window, silent, watching the glow spread across the snow. Emily joined him, Sophie in her arms. They're here for you, she said softly. No, Nathan replied. They're here for what we all forgot to care. His voice broke the sound, barely a whisper. Maybe this is how it starts again. Emily leaned against his shoulder, her eyes reflecting the candlelight. For the first time, the house of silence wasn't alone against the noise of the world. It was surrounded by the hum of humanity, rediscovering its heart. And though the storm outside had turned to whispers, something inside both of them had begun to roar an unspoken promise that redemption once found could never be taken away again. Winter came back with a vengeance, as if the mountains had been waiting to test their fragile peace. The first flakes began to fall quietly, at dusk soft and harmless, but by midnight the sky had turned wild again. The wind screamed through the pines, bending branches until they snapped like bones. Nathan stood by the window, phone pressed to his ear, his face pale under the flickering light. "Yes, I understand," he said tightly. "Just keep the roads open as long as you can." The voice on the other end crackled. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hale. State Patrol says all routes are closing within the hour." He hung up, his pulse pounding. In the living room, Emily was wrapping Sophie in a blanket, her face drawn with worry. The little girl's cheeks were flushed, her breath coming too fast. "She's burning up again," Emily said, panic edging her voice. Nathan crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling beside her. He pressed his hand to Sophie's forehead. The heat radiated through his skin. "Her lungs," he said quietly. "The pneumonia's back." Emily shook her head, tears welling. "I thought she was better." "She was," Nathan said, grabbing his coat. "Until now." He looked at the clock. Midnight. The nearest hospital was 30 miles away. The roads half buried already. But the color of Sophie's lips told him there wasn't time to wait. "We're taking her in," he said. Emily's eyes widened. "Nathan, the storm, I don't care." He turned toward the door. "Get her ready." Minutes later, the old SUV was rumbling down. The mountain road snow swirling like ghosts in the headlights. Emily sat in the back seat, holding Sophie close, whispering prayers into the darkness. Nathan's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Stay with me, kid," he muttered, eyes flicking to the mirror, where Sophie lay limp against her mother's shoulder. The road twisted and vanished under drifts of snow. Wind battered the car visibility, shrinking to nothing. Emily gasped as the tires slid. "Nathan," he jerked the wheel, heart hammering. "I've got it," but he didn't. A sheet of ice caught the tires, and the SUV spun metal screaming. The world tilted, then slammed sideways. When the silence came back, it was deafening. Nathan blinked, dazed, tasting blood. The windshield was cracked snow, blowing in through a shattered window. "Emily," he rasped. "You okay?" I think so," she said, voice shaking. Sophie. Nathan turned. The girl was motionless, still wrapped in the blanket. He reached back, fingers trembling, and felt for a pulse. Weak but there. Relief cut through the pain. "She's alive." He looked out at the storm. They were half buried already. "We can't stay here. We'll freeze." "Then what do we do?" Emily cried. He met her eyes, resolve hardening. "We walk." She stared at him like he'd gone mad. "It's miles to the highway. Then we start now." He grabbed a flashlight, wrapped Sophie tighter in the blanket, and lifted her into his arms. "Follow me." The wind tore at them the moment they stepped out. The snow was knee-deep, the cold slicing like knives. Nathan pushed forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps, Sophie's weight heavy against his chest. Emily trudged behind him, clutching his coat to keep from losing him in the white blur. "Nathan, you'll die out here," she shouted over the wind. He turned his head, his voice raw. "Not until she breathes again." Each step was agony. The cold gnawed through his boots, his muscles screaming. But he kept moving, one foot, then the next. Sophie's small hand slipped from the blanket, pale against the storm. He pressed her closer. "Stay with me, kid," he whispered. "You hear me? You've got too much to live for." Emily stumbled beside him, her tears freezing on her face. She wanted to tell him to stop, to rest, but something in his eyes kept her silent, a fire she hadn't seen before, fierce and unrelenting. After an hour that felt like forever, headlights appeared through the curtain of snow. Nathan waved frantically, shouting until his throat tore. A snowplow screeched to a stop. 2 paramedics jumped out, grabbing them both. "We've got her," one yelled. The world blurred in flashes of light and sound. The next thing Emily knew, they were inside an ambulance. Sophie was on a gurney, an oxygen mask over her face. Nathan leaned against the wall, blood running from a cut on his forehead. "She's hypoxic," one paramedic said. "We'll need to transfuse." "She's type AB negative," Nathan croaked. "You sure positive?" "Then she's lucky," the medic said. "It's rare." "So am I." Nathan said, voice cracking. "Take mine." Emily's head snapped toward him. "Nathan, no, you're hurt." "Doesn't matter." He gripped her hand. "She needs me more." The medic hesitated. "We can't do it," Nathan barked. The room filled with motion hands tubes, flashing lights. Emily watched as his blood flowed through the line into her daughter's veins. His face grew pale, his body trembling. "Nathan," she whispered, clutching his hand. "Please, you've done enough." He smiled faintly, eyes half-lidded. "You already said that once." "Then listen this time," she said through tears. His head fell back, breath shallow. "You already buried enough," she whispered fiercely. "Don't leave us now." His lips parted, barely audible. "Not planning to." Then everything went dark. The next hours blurred into hospital lights and waiting rooms, prayers and monitors, beeping like distant heartbeats. When Emily opened her eyes again, she was in a chair beside 2 beds, one small, one large. Sophie was asleep, her color returning. Nathan lay still, pale but breathing. Emily rose, her heart swelling with a mix of exhaustion and awe. She took his hand, cold but steady. "You saved her again," she whispered, "but this time I won't let you disappear after." Outside, the storm finally broke the clouds, splitting open to reveal a gray dawn. Snow still blanketed everything, but for the first time in a long while, the world felt alive. Inside that hospital room, the man who had once buried his heart had bled it back to life for someone else. And the woman who had come begging to bury her child had learned that love, even in the middle of a storm, could still bring the dead back to breathing. Nathan woke to the faint hum of hospital machines and the muted rhythm of winter rain tapping against the window. For a moment he thought he was back in the past, those long nights when monitors had beeped for his wife, instead of him when hope had sounded exactly the same as heartbreak. But then a soft voice broke through the fog. "You're awake." Emily sat beside him, her eyes swollen from tears, but glowing with relief. She reached for his hand, and he realized how pale hers was, how tightly she'd been holding on. "How long?" he asked hoarsely. 2 days, she said. "Sophie's stable. The doctors said you lost a lot of blood." He exhaled, sinking back into the pillow. "Is she really okay?" "Yes," Emily whispered, smiling through trembling lips. "She's breathing." Nathan closed his eyes. The words felt like sunlight. For a long moment, neither spoke. The sound of Sophie's quiet breathing from the next bed filled the silence. Emily looked at him, her voice soft but steady. "You know, when I first came to your door, I thought God had abandoned me. I didn't know he'd just changed his address." Nathan's throat tightened. "Don't give me that kind of credit," he said, his voice low. "If anything, I was the one who closed every door that could have helped." Emily reached into her bag and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It was creased and yellowed, the ink smudged from old tears. She handed it to him. "You recognize this?" Nathan unfolded it. His stomach dropped. At the top, his company's logo, Hale Bio Health Insurance. Below, in small black print, the words, "Claim denied." It was the same form he had seen countless times. but this one bore the signature of approval, his own. "This was the letter that killed your wife," Emily said quietly. "And this is the same kind of letter that nearly killed my daughter." Nathan stared at the page, every word burning into him like acid. He saw the date 3 years ago, the same week his world had collapsed. He'd signed hundreds of these, never imagining that each one was a door closing on someone's life. "I built a system to save people," he whispered, voice breaking, "and it destroyed them instead." Emily touched his hand gently. "Then rebuild it," she said simply. "You can't change the past, Nathan, but you can decide what kind of man you are now." He looked up at her, searching her face for disbelief, for anger. There was none, only quiet conviction. "You really think anyone would trust me again?" he asked. "I do," she said, "because I've seen the man who carried a child through a blizzard and gave his own blood to keep her alive. That's not a headline, Nathan. That's redemption." Her words hit him like warmth, seeping into frozen ground. He turned his gaze towards Sophie, still sleeping peacefully. Her tiny fingers curled around the edge of her blanket, the same blanket he'd once thought would become her shroud. "You're right," he said softly. "It's time I start saving people for real." Days later, when he was discharged, the world was waiting. Reporters lined the steps of the hospital, microphones thrust forward like spears. "Mr. Hale, is it true you donated blood to the same child who nearly died? Because of your company's policies?" Nathan paused at the top of the steps, Emily beside him, Sophie's small hand gripping hers. He could have stayed silent. He could have walked away. But something in him had changed. "It's true," he said, his voice calm but strong. "And it's also true that I'm responsible for creating a system that failed too many people, including my own family." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed. "So what happens now, Mr. Hale?" someone shouted. Nathan took a breath, the wind cold on his face. "Now," he said, "we rebuild it right." That afternoon, the news spread faster than any scandal ever had. Former CEO Nathan Hale announces launch of the Hale Foundation. Free healthcare for single mothers and children in need. Donations poured in. The very name once synonymous with greed became a symbol of mercy. In one interview, a journalist asked him why he was doing it. His answer was simple: "Because the woman who begged me to bury her child ended up teaching me how to live again." Months passed, and winter softened into spring. The first Hale Foundation clinic opened in Boston, a bright building with walls painted the color of dawn. Nathan stood on the front steps beside Emily and Sophie as the ribbon was cut. The little girl grinned up at him, holding a small wooden carving of an angel he'd made for her during his recovery. "It's you," she said proudly. "You're the angel." He laughed, his chest tightening with emotion. "I think you've got the wrong guy." "No," Emily said, smiling. "She's right." He turned to her, the crowd fading around them. "You know," he said, "I used to think redemption was a myth. Something people tell themselves to sleep at night. But now," she asked softly, "now I think it's something you have to earn. And I want to spend the rest of my life earning it." For a heartbeat, everything stilled. The noise of the city, the applause, the flashing lights, it all fell away. Emily reached up, brushing her fingers against his cheek. "You already have," she whispered. Later that night, as the clinic's lights dimmed and the streets outside glowed with the last traces of daylight, Nathan sat at his desk, pen in hand. He wrote the first line of a letter that would go on the wall of every Hale Foundation building. To those who were once denied mercy, you are the reason we began again. He looked up and saw Emily standing in the doorway, Sophie asleep on her shoulder. "You're still working?" she asked, smiling softly. "Just finishing something important." "Come to bed," she said. "You can save the world tomorrow." He chuckled, setting the pen down. "You sound like someone who's done this before." "I have," she teased, "saved someone stubborn." He walked to her, resting his hand on her arm. "Emily," he said quietly, "thank you for knocking on my door that night." Her eyes shimmered. "You opened it," she said. "That's what changed everything." The rain outside turned to a soft drizzle, the city lights reflecting like stars in the puddles. Nathan looked out the window, then back at her. "You know," he murmured, "I think she saved us both." "She?" Emily asked, glancing down at Sophie. "Her," he said, nodding, "and maybe love itself." In that quiet moment, as thunder rumbled softly over the city, the man who had once been haunted by loss finally understood redemption wasn't about forgetting the pain. It was about turning it into something that could heal others. And for Nathan Hale, the healing had just begun. 1 year later, the Vermont mountains were in bloom again. The snow had melted into streams that ran clear and soft through the valleys, and wildflowers covered the fields where the storm once raged. The Hale estate no longer stood in isolation, but as a symbol of rebirth. What was once a fortress of silence had become the headquarters of the Hale Foundation, its halls echoing with laughter music and the shuffle of volunteers. Nathan stood on the porch early one morning, a mug of coffee in his hands, watching as the world woke up around him. The air smelled of pine and earth, and somewhere in the distance, a bell from the clinic rang a sound that meant someone new was being cared for. He smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes softer now, his gaze warmer. Behind him, Emily's voice floated through the open door. "You're up early again." He turned, watching her step outside. With Sophie, who now wore her first pair of gardening gloves, oversized and clumsy. She insisted on helping, Emily said, smiling. Sophie ran ahead, her laughter bright. "Uncle Ben said we're planting new flowers today." "Uncle Ben's too soft," Nathan said with mock sternness, sipping his coffee. "He lets you get away with everything." Sophie grinned. "That's because he says I'm brave." "He's right," Nathan said softly. He knelt down to her level, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You remember what I told you about the garden?" She nodded. Everything that grows here came from something that almost didn't. Nathan smiled. "Exactly." Sophie dashed off toward the field where volunteers were setting up flower beds. Emily stepped closer to him, her hands slipping into her sweater pockets. "She's changed so much," she said. "So have you," he replied. "You look peaceful." "I am," she said. For the first time in years. They stood side by side in silence, the morning light spilling across their faces. Below, the hill rows of new gardens stretched along the old fence line, the same fence Nathan had once built to keep the world out. Now it marked the boundary of the Foundation's healing garden, a place where survivors, widows, and children came to work the soil, to breathe, to start over. Nathan had called it the Garden of Second Chances. "It's strange," Emily said. "After a while, how this place used to feel like a grave. And now it feels alive. Maybe it was waiting for something worth growing," Nathan said, glancing at her. She met his eyes, and the air between them felt full again. Gentle, familiar, unspoken. Later that afternoon, the Foundation hosted its 1-year celebration. Guests from all over, arrived former patients, doctors, donors, journalists. Cameras flashed, but this time Nathan didn't mind. He walked through the crowd with Emily by his side, greeting people who once only knew his name through scandal and headlines. "Mr. Hale," a reporter called. "How does it feel, seeing this all come full circle?" Nathan smiled. "It feels like breathing again." The reporter lowered the microphone, smiling softly. "That's a good answer." Across the yard, Sophie stood near a fountain dedicated to her, the Sophie Carter Pavilion. It bore an inscription carved into stone where mercy was lost. Love rebuilt it. She traced the letters with her finger and looked up at Nathan. "Mommy says you wrote that. We both did," he said, walking over. "It's your story, too." "Then it's our story," Sophie said proudly. Emily laughed from behind him. "She's been saying that all week." Nathan looked at them both, emotion catching in his throat. "She's right." As the sun dipped behind the mountains, the celebration turned quiet. Guests drifted home, the sound of music fading into the twilight. Only a few lights remained burning in the windows. Nathan and Emily stood by the old pine tree that had survived every winter, its trunk now bearing a small wooden sign. "She's still breathing, and so am I." "You really carved it," Emily said softly, tracing the letters. "I had to," Nathan replied. That night those words were all I had. And now she asked. "Now they're a promise," he said, "that we keep going no matter how much the world takes from us." She smiled, tears glinting in her eyes. "You've kept every promise you ever made, Nathan." "Not all of them," he said, turning toward her. "I never promised you what I felt." The words hung in the cool air. Emily looked up at him, heart pounding. "And what do you feel?" Then took her hand, his voice barely above a whisper. "That you were never just a woman who came to my door. You were the one who made me open it again." Emily's breath caught. The evening light turned golden, the mountains glowing like they were on fire. "You don't have to say that," she murmured. "I already know." But he did say it. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against her cheek. "I love you, Emily." The words were quiet, but sure, the kind of truth that didn't need to be loud. Emily's eyes filled with tears, her smile trembling. "I love you too," she whispered. He leaned in, and their foreheads touched. No grand gestures, no music, just two souls who had finally stopped running from the pain that made them human. Sophie's voice called from the porch, breaking the stillness. "Mom, Nathan." "Come see, the stars are out." They laughed softly and turned toward her. The three of them sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sky fill with silver light. "You think the stars remember us?" Sophie asked sleepily. "I think they remember everyone who keeps trying," Nathan said. Emily rested her head on his shoulder. "Then we'll keep trying," she whispered. "Always." Down in the garden, the lanterns flickered one by one, glowing like fireflies over the flowers that had been planted, in memory of all the lives the storm had almost taken. In the silence that followed, the wind carried the faint scent of pine, and something new, something like forgiveness. Nathan looked at the world he'd once hidden from, and felt finally that it was home. The house that had once been built to bury grief was now a place that grew second chances. And somewhere deep inside, he knew the truth that love doesn't erase the scars, it makes them worth surviving. The next winter arrived softer than the last. The storms were gentler, the roads clearer, and the world, at least the small corner of it that surrounded the Hale Foundation, seemed to have learned how to breathe again. It was the night of the Foundation's annual gala, held not in some glittering New York ballroom, but right there in Vermont, under strings of golden lights, draped across the restored barn. The walls were lined with photographs, women and children whose lives had been changed, clinics built across the country, volunteers smiling through long shifts. On the far wall hung the original photograph that started it all. Emily standing in front of the old Hale Estate gates, holding Sophie wrapped in a blanket, and Nathan beside them, his arm steady around both. The caption read, "The night everything changed." Inside, guests filled the space, their laughter mingling with the hum of the band playing softly in the corner. Emily stood on stage, her dress simple, elegant, her hair pinned back. The microphone trembled slightly in her hands. She glanced toward the crowd, and for a moment her eyes found Nathan's calm, reassuring, proud. Then she began to speak. A year ago she said, her voice clear and low, "I knocked on a stranger's door during a snowstorm, holding my daughter in my arms, certain I was about to lose her. I didn't come looking for hope. I came begging for a burial." The audience fell silent. That night, she continued, I met a man who had forgotten how to feel, and I was a woman who had forgotten how to believe. But something miraculous happened. He opened the door. She paused, smiling softly, and because of that, both of us started breathing again. A murmur swept through the crowd, people dabbing their eyes, couples holding hands tighter. Emily gestured toward a photograph projected behind her, Nathan, carrying Sophie through the snow. His face streaked with blood and determination. He risked his life to save a child who wasn't his, she said. And in doing so, he found what he thought he'd buried forever, his heart. She looked at Nathan again. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable, but full of warmth. Tonight, she said, I don't want to talk about tragedy. I want to talk about kindness, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't make headlines, the kind that knocks on a door or opens one. She smiled at the audience, her voice trembling with emotion, because sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. The room erupted in applause, not loud or frenzied, but long and heartfelt, the kind that comes from people who understand. When the lights dimmed, Nathan joined her on stage. The crowd cheered as he took the microphone. She gives me too much credit, he said with a small smile. Truth is, she saved me too. Emily and Sophie, they gave me back the reason I started all this in the first place. He gestured toward the photographs lining the walls. We built the Hale Foundation not to erase what was lost, but to make sure no one else has to beg for mercy ever again. His voice softened. And we did it together. As the audience rose to their feet, Emily slipped her hand into his. They stood there for a moment, the lights warm on their faces, the applause echoing like the heartbeat of a shared redemption. Afterward, the three of them stepped outside. Snow was falling again, just as it had that first night. But now it was gentle, forgiving. Sophie ran ahead, her boots leaving small prints across the path that led to the healing garden. The lanterns glowed along the fence line, and the pine tree still stood tall at trunk, carved with the words that had once saved them both. She's still breathing, and so am I. It's snowing again, Sophie said, holding out her hands. Do you think the sky remembers? It always does. Emily said, kneeling to zip her daughter's coat. It remembers everything that survived. Nathan slipped an arm around Emily's shoulders, pulling her close. And everything worth keeping, he added. She looked up at him, smiling. That includes us. Especially us, he said. They walked together toward the garden where candles burned low in the snow, each one placed by someone the foundation had helped. A nurse from the Bronx, a mother from Detroit, a teenage boy who had lost his father in the war. Each flame told a story. Emily stopped beside one candle and read the name written on it, Lydia Boone. Nathan froze. "My wife," he said softly. Emily looked at him surprised. "Who placed it?" He smiled faintly. "I did. Every year I light one for her, because she taught me something I only understood when I met you. What's that love doesn't die, it just changes shape." For a moment the only sound was the wind brushing through the trees. Then Sophie's small voice broke the silence. "Mommy, can I light one too?" "Of course," Emily said. Nathan handed her a match, steadying her tiny fingers as she struck it. The flame flickered to life, and Sophie bent down lighting a candle beside her father's. "Who's that one for?" Nathan asked gently. "For all the people who still need someone to open the door," she said. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Nathan swallowed hard, his voice rough. "You've got your mother's heart." Sophie grinned. "And your stubbornness." They laughed quietly together, the sound warm against the cold. As the last guests left and the lights dimmed across the estate, the three of them stood in the snow, watching the candles glow across the garden like stars fallen to earth. Emily slipped her arm through Nathan's and leaned her head against his shoulder. "You think it'll last?" she asked softly. "The foundation, the hope." Nathan looked out across the field where people had once come to bury grief and now came to plant it into something that grew. "If we keep choosing kindness," he said, "it will. Even when no one's watching, especially then." Emily smiled her breath, misting in the cold. "That's the quiet power of kindness, isn't it?" "Yeah," he said. "It's the kind that doesn't shout. It just stays." The wind carried their words away into the night, but the meaning lingered like the warmth of the candles, like the pulse of a story that had found its home. Sophie tugged their hands. "Can we go inside now? It's cold." "In a minute," Nathan said, looking up at the stars. "Just one more look." Emily followed his gaze. Above them the night was vast and full of light. Each star shimmered like a memory, a reminder that even after everything, beauty could still rise from brokenness. They stood there until the cold bit at their cheeks, until the candles flickered low, until the past no longer felt like something to run from, but something to honor. Then as they turned toward the house, their house, Emily paused, glancing back once more at the garden. "You know," she said quietly, "some love stories don't begin with flowers or vows." Nathan smiled, finishing the thought they'd shared so many times before. They begin with a knock on the door with blood in the snow, and a second chance. Emily nodded, tears glistening in her eyes, and sometimes she whispered, "They end with a life rebuilt from mercy." They stepped through the doorway, the light spilling over them, warm and golden. The camera of memory panned out slowly, the house glowing in the snow, the garden alight with hundreds of tiny flames, and above it all a sky wide enough to hold every story ever told. A quiet voice echoed, gentle but sure. If this story touched your soul, leave a comment, share it, and keep believing in the quiet power of kindness. Because sometimes one open door can change the world.